Now we're going to take a look at the Slackware installation. The Slackware distribution was created by Patrick Volkerding, and the first thing that we need to do, we have to decide how we're going to partition our hard drive. I've already made that decision here. If we take a look at this hard drive partition using the DOS F disk, we're starting off in DOS, and we can go and look at the partition information by selecting option 4, and here we're inside of F disk looking at the partition table, or in other words how the hard disk drive is divided up, and we can see that our first partition is drive C, and it contains a DOS file system. It's 100 megabytes in size, and that is 25% of the hard disk space. As you can see below, the total disk space is 406 megabytes. So in other words, around 300 megabytes I'm devoting to Linux. So we can get out of F disk by pressing escape. And one more time. And we're back to the familiar MS-DOS C prompt. The first thing that we're going to need to do is insert the CD-ROM into our CD-ROM drive. Now I have an IDE CD-ROM drive. It's by TIAC. It's one of the newer 6x or 6 times speed IDE drives, and I'll go ahead and change to that drive now, and we'll take a look at the directories at the root of the D drive, which is the CD-ROM drive, and we can see a number of directories. This particular CD-ROM, which has Slackware on it, which is a popular distribution available by many different vendors. This Slackware version is the one that is included on the CD-ROM on Yggdrasil's Linux Bible. So now we need to navigate to the Slackware directory. The Slackware directory is the SLACKWAR directory. So that's SLACKWAR. I need to change to that. Now I need to look at the contents of that directory. From here I can see a number of interesting directories. The ones that concern me are on this distribution, and every Slackware distribution you'll find similar directories. I want to go and look at the contents of the installed directory. And here I'll see two important files. One is gzip.exe and the other is rawwrite.exe. gzip.exe is a DOS utility that will allow me to compress and uncompress in the gzip format. Rawwrite is a utility that we saw in the previous installation, which allows us to write bootable images to a disk drive, which will allow me to boot from that disk drive. So this is the location of a few of the utilities that I will need to do the installation of Slackware. Also, you notice there is also a FIPS or FIPS directory. In that directory, you'll find a non-destructive hard disk drive partitioning utility. This utility has been out on the market for a number of years, and Yggdrasil makes no guarantees on or takes any of the responsibilities of anything that happens using FIPS. But it is there, and people have had success with using FIPS. So now I'll go back to the Slackware directory, and I'll take another look at the directory structure. And I see that there are several other directories that I'm really interested in. One of them is boot dsks.12 and boot dsks.114. These two directories contain the boot images. In other words, it contains images that we are going to copy to a floppy drive. Now the bootdisk.12 directory contains boot images for a disk if you have a 1.2 meg disk drive as your primary drive, or your drive A, your floppy drive A. Bootdisks.144 is for the 1.44 meg drives. In other words, if I have a 1.44 meg floppy drive as my drive A, I'll want to go to that directory to get my boot images. Also, there are rootdisk.12 and rootdisk.144 directories. These directories contain the root disk that we are going to have to make. And once again, the rootdisk.12 directory contains the root disk image for the 1.2 meg floppy drive, and the rootdisk.144 directory contains images for making a root disk on a 1.44 meg floppy drive. What I need to do is go to the bootdisk.144 directory. I'll get a listing of that directory now, and I can see a number of files under here. The IDE CD file is the boot image file for your IDE CD-ROM drives, and the IDE CD.gz is a compressed version of that file. You would use the gzip utility to uncompress that file if you needed to. However, the IDE CD file is an uncompressed version of the IDE CD.gz file. So which one of these images will I need to put onto my floppy drive? This file, which is called which.1 or which one, will tell you which one of these images you need to put down onto the root disk, or onto the boot disk, excuse me. We'll take a look at that file now. Now that I've brought up the which.1 file using the DOS edit tool, the first thing that it says here is there's a question. There are so many boot disks, which one should I use? Well, here's a little table that helps you decide, and we'll go ahead and scroll down through this list, and we can see all the various options that we have here. Now, I have an IDE hard drive, and my Slackware source is on an IDE drive. So if I look at here, which is the IDE drive, and I go under the column for, I'm putting it onto an IDE hard drive, it says that the kernel that I need to, or the boot image that I need, is the IDE CD boot image. So that's the one that I'll use. I'll get out of here and I'll go back to seeing the IDE CD boot image, and the utility that I can use to copy the IDE CD boot image to my boot disk that I will be using to boot up into Linux for the installation. I can use the utility called raw write. We found the raw write in the directory install. Let me change to install. And there is rawwrite.exe. Now what I'll do is I'll go back to the boot disks. Now from here, I can go to the install directory and use the utility rawwrite. Now it wants to know what our source file will be. They're asking which boot image will I want to transfer to the floppy disk. I say IDE CD. And it wants to know what the destination drive is. I say A. Notice it says that it wants a formatted disk. Well, this is a DOS formatted disk. I'll put that into drive A and press enter. Now that I've done the transfer using rawwrite to the floppy disk with the image, in other words, I have made a boot image, I clearly label that as my boot disk, my Slackware boot disk. I clearly labeled that one. Next, I need to make a transfer of a root disk to my floppy disk. So I need to go to the root disk, and of course I have a 1.44 meg floppy drive, so I go to that directory. If you had a 1.2 meg hard drive, or 5 1/4 in other words, you would want to go to the root disk.12 directory. Here I'll list the contents. Once again, I'll use the rawwrite utility, which is located in the directory below in the install directory, and we'll use rawwrite. Now it wants to know what the source file is. Well, once again, I said that was color 144, and it wants to know what drive. Once again, that's a 1.44 meg DOS formatted floppy. I'll put that into drive A and I'll press enter, and it'll transfer color 144 image over onto the floppy disk. Now that I have both my root disk and my boot disks made using the rawwrite utility, and I have them clearly labeled as boot disk and root disk, at this point in time I can go ahead and begin the installation of the Slackware distribution. I do this by inserting the boot disk that I've just made into my floppy drive A, and then I reset the computer. I can do this by pressing Control, Alt, and Delete, or by pressing the reset key. This will reboot the computer. You're going to see the examples here of we can enter information at the boot prompt here, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to say RAM disk. We're going to enter the parameter that HDB equals CD-ROM. Do not be concerned with the information necessarily at this time that has been displayed on the screen. What has happened here, it has looked to find if we have had any SCSI drives. It was trying to find out what type of hard drives that we have and what the CD-ROM is. It successfully found the CD-ROM, and it also successfully found that we have a hard drive. Next, it is asking us to put the RAM disk, or what we call the root disk, in Slackware. Even though it says RAM disk on the screen, they are referring to the root disk that we made, the root disk floppy. I'll press enter. We need to log in as root, and we need to partition our hard drive using Linux's fdisk. So that's what we'll do first. We'll log in as root, and then we'll type fdisk. And the next parameter here that I'm putting in is I'm saying that I want to have the first, and in this case the only, hard drive on my system to be partitioned or looked at by fdisk. In Linux, or in any of the Unix-like operating systems, we do not use drive letters like drive letter C or D like in DOS. What we do is we use what are called the device names. Device names are found in the /dev directory, or the device directory under Unix. And HDA means that it's the first hard drive, or hard drive A, the first one. So we are brought now to the fdisk prompt. At this time, we'd use the fdisk utility just in the same way as we did in the Yggdrasil distribution. So let's go ahead and move on. The next thing that we need to do is we need to begin installing the Slackware installation, and we do this as root by typing setup. It brings us to this dialog. This is the Slackware Linux setup dialog. You can navigate through this by using the arrow keys. The first option that you're able to use is the help option, where you can read about the setup help. And the key map, you can remap your keyboard if you're not using a United States type keyboard. In our case we are, so I don't have to do anything here. I can choose between quick or verbose install mode. At the current time we're in verbose, and the first time that you install Slackware, I recommend that you keep it in the verbose mode. Make tags is an expert's customization feature in Slackware. Experts can go in and customize what are called tag files to pre-select packages and options that they want to install. I recommend that you leave this alone if this is your first time. Okay, our next option is the add swap option, which we can set up our swap partitions. Now from this point on, Slackware pretty much takes you and handholds you from one section to the next, as we'll soon see. So this is what we want to do now. We've already set up our swap partition, and we set up the swap partition type to be of type swap. So we'll go to there by pressing the enter key. It has detected the swap partition because we set it to ID 82. So it's confirming that we want to install this as our swap partition. And here's another warning. If we've made any of our swap partitions active, then we don't want to allow setup to use make swap on our swap partitions. So, do we want to use make swap on our swap partition? The answer to this question is yes, because this is our first installation. And we haven't already activated our swap partition with swap on, so we need to do it this time. So it's asking if we want to activate the swap partition with swap on. Our answer is yes. Okay, so now it has added the swap space, it's configured it, and it has added it to our /etc/fstab file. The fstab stands for File System Table, and the entry that is listed below is what has been entered into that file system table. it has said that our third partition on hard disk drive A is a swap partition, and it's going to take the defaults. Now that we've set up our swap space, we want to continue on with the installation. We decided that /dev/HDA2 was going to be our root partition. This partition hasn't been formatted. It was partitioned but not formatted, so we need to format it now, and we'll do a quick format. It found that we had more than one partition as a Linux native file system, and so it's going to ask some questions about that. We already have HDA2 mounted as our slash partition. This is known as our root partition, and so we want to mount our other large directories on separate partitions perhaps. That's why I said that we should put our home directories there. So that's what we're going to do. We'll answer this question, yes. And it wants to know which partition that we want to use. That's /dev/HDA4, which we're going to designate as our home partition. We'll want to format it real quick. We'll use the defaults. And partitions need to be mounted. We're going to put it in our home directory, so that's where we're going to mount /dev/HDA4 as home. That's how I designate that. And once again, this entry will be added into our FS tab file, which is the file system table. Notice that /dev/HDA4 with the mount point of home, and it's an ext2. That means the second extended file system for Linux, and it's taking the default. And would we like to mount some more partitions? We can say yes to this. And here it says enter the partition you would like to use, or type quit to quit adding new partitions. So we'll enter Q here for quit adding new partitions. And it found that we do have a DOS file system on board here, and it wants to know if we would like to make some of these partitions visible from Linux. Well, that's a good idea. I can read and write to my DOS file system from here, and I'll be able to use the DOS emulator and use some of the files from my DOS partition, so I can make it available from Linux. So I'll answer this question yes. It wants to know which partition we want to access from Linux. In this case, there's only one. It's /dev/HDA, which is our first hard drive, and 1, which is the first partition on that hard drive. Now it wants to know where to mount this within our directory tree. To mount it under DOS C, because that's like my C drive under DOS, so that's sort of a remembrance I can use as DOS C. And once again, it has added that partition to our FS tab. Now we don't need to enter any more partitions, so we can enter Q here to quit adding new partitions. And now that we've set up our target, that's where we're going to put Linux, it wants to know if we want to go on to the source selection and select our installation media. And of course we do. So we're going to install from a CD-ROM. So we'll navigate down to that selection 5, press the OK by hitting the Enter key. And we're going to install directly from the Slackware CD-ROM. And the type of CD-ROM that we have is the IDE interface CD-ROM, which is selection number 7. We press the Enter. Well, ours is HDB, which is the primary IDE drive number 2. We can run most of the Slackware from the CD-ROM if we want to, if we're short on drive space, or we just want to test out Linux. I don't recommend doing that because it runs rather slowly from a CD-ROM. You want to have a usable system, so you want to go ahead and do a normal installation to the hard drive. This is a term that Slackware uses. It's called disk sets, and we'll see what they are in a second. If I get to an option that I want to install, I can go ahead and press the space bar to toggle on these, so that will be selected. So let's say, of course I want to have the base Linux system, and for the sake of brevity, I am going to just select a few things here to install. I want to put the X Windows system because I want to demonstrate it being installed, and some X applications also. But there are many different things that I can select here, but I'm going to just select these few. Now that we've decided what we want to install, we can begin by moving to the installation section. The prompting mode, which is we just want to use the normal default tag files that are already present in Slackware. And you want to use this mode especially if this is your first time installing Slackware. Well, it's installing what is called Disk Series A because Slackware has the unique ability between all the distributions to be installed entirely from floppy disks. And the disk series, you can have like which A1 would fit, are files that would fit onto one floppy disk. In the upper right hand corner you'll see a priority listing. It'll say priority required or priority recommended or priority optional. Right here it's asking if we want to install a kernel version that doesn't have SCSI support right here. The options that I have, I can use the arrow key to go between either yes, install the package, or no, do not install the package. Notice here, you have to install one kernel. Wants to know if we want to do IDE support with SCSI here. We don't need this one right here because we don't have SCSI on ours, so I'll answer this no, do not install. One of the hardest things about the Slackware distribution is setting on your hands, because at times after hitting the enter key a number of times, when you see a screen, you'll have the tendency, a lot of people do, to hit the enter key. If it's on a screen that is not asking you to install or not to install, or to install, which is giving you an option to do so, if you press the enter key gets buffered, and so the next time it is looking for an answer from you, it will assume that it already has the answer, and it will go ahead and install that package or do something that you don't want to do. So my recommendation is to take your time with Slackware and learn to set on your hands. And now you want to answer each one of the dialog boxes with the appropriate answer. But for the sake of brevity, we're going to fast forward to the selection of the X server that is appropriate for your machine. Now we're going to go into installing Disk Series X. We're going to be asked which server that we want to install. Now I have already used, I already know what chip set is on my card, and so I'm going to use the Super VGA server. So I do not want to install this server. There are several servers on here that the Slackware installation will ask you if you want to install that server or not. So no, I do not want to install this server. It wants to know if I want to install this server. No, I do not. It's not the type that I want to install. It's asking if I have a Mach 32 chip. No, I do not. I have a Mach 8 chipset. No, I do not. Wants to know if I want to use it as a monochrome server. That'd be pretty boring, so no, I don't. Wants to know if I'm using a P9000 chipset. No, I'm not. Wants to know if I'm using an accelerated server for cards using the S3 chipset. No, I'm not. You can find out what chipsets that you have by looking at the card or by looking in your video documentation, your video card documentation. Now this is a super for just super VGA cards. That's what I will go ahead and install here. Wants to know if we want color icons. That would be nice. And now we'll be going back to answering individual dialog boxes with the correct answers, but for the sake of brevity, we're going to fast forward to the Slackware configuration. Now it wants to configure our system, so that's exactly what we're going to do. You should go ahead and make a boot disk. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and continue with the configuration instead of making the boot disk. But once again, I caution you, make a boot disk. We do not have a modem onto this on this machine here. And so it says, would you like to set up your modem? The answer is no. This will ask if we want to configure a link to our mouse device. So we want to say yes if we'd like to set up our mouse. And we happen to have a Microsoft compatible mouse, so I'll just press OK here. It wants to know what our mouse serial port is. Ours is on COM1 under DOS or TTY-S0 under Linux. Now it wants to set up Lilo, the Linux loader. In our case, we would want to do something like this: HDB equals CD-ROM, because we have an IDE CD-ROM drive. Now Lilo can be put in a number of places, so we want to put it on the master boot record. We'll just go ahead and select the defaults here. It's putting it on the master boot record of our hard disk drive. We can choose a delay in here. And the reason why we want to have a delay is that I can select the order that I want to boot in what operating system. For example, at my system at home, I have Linux on there and I have DOS on there on my system, and so I have it set up where after 5 seconds, if no selection is made, it automatically goes ahead and boots into DOS. This is a concern for people that have a computer that a number of people have access to. So we'll go ahead and put up a 5-second delay. The first thing that I want to do is add a DOS partition to the Lilo configure file. Whatever partition I add first, that will be the default partition into which, after the time delay, Lilo will boot into. And so in this case, I'll select DOS, and if after 5 seconds I do not make any selection, Lilo will boot into DOS for me. It wants us to identify which DOS partition to go ahead and boot from. And I'll enter HDA1, which is our only DOS partition, but this can show you that there can be multiple operating systems on here, and at boot time you can select which one that you want to boot from and ask for a short unique name for this. I'm going to say DOS. Now I want to add the Linux partition to the configuration file. The Linux partition that I want to boot to is the root partition, which, if you recall, is /dev/HDA2, or the second partition on hard drive A, and wants us to use a short name so that we can tell the bootloader which operating system to load into, and I'll select Linux. Next, I'm going to install Linux. Basic idea behind Linux, Lilo, is this. At boot time, there is no operating system on your computer. And because there is no operating system on your computer, it does not know about the file systems. And because it does not know about the file system, it cannot read the lilo.config file that we're creating here. So what the Lilo utility does is it reads the information contained into the Lilo config file, and it puts that information onto the master boot record. The master boot record will contain information as to where the exact point is on the disk on our hard drive that we want to go ahead and boot from. And that's why when we install Lilo and we put that information on the master boot record, if we make any changes to the Lilo config file, what we need to do is rerun Lilo again so that information will be rewritten to the master boot record. So we'll install Lilo now. Now it wants us to set up our time zone. We are US Pacific. And now that our system configuration is complete, we want to reboot our machine. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to exit, and we're going to reboot our machine. We can do that by typing reboot. We're rebooting the system now, and we'll get up to the Lilo prompt, and within 5 seconds we have to react. And we can do that by hitting the control key, which will give us the boot, and I'll be able to type Linux in this point in time, and as we can see, it'll go into Linux. We have successfully installed Lilo and the Linux operating system onto our hard drive. The next step is, after that we have Linux up and running, we need to install X, and that will be our next step. When we want to install X, we have certain responsibilities of knowing what information is on our machine. For example, we need to know what video chipset that we have. We need to know what kind of mouse we have. We need to know what type of monitor we have. And if we know that information, and you can get that from the documentation, the user manuals that come with when you buy the hardware, then you should be able to install X Windows without a problem. Now, it's asking me to do a login. I type root here because I'm going to be logging in as a root user. And it notifies me that I have some mail. Now I need to find out some certain information. For example, I want to know what video chipset that I have here. I can use the utility superprobe, and superprobe will come back with information telling me what type of chipset that I have on this card here. It says that I have a Super VGA, and that the chipset that I have is a Cirrus CL-GD5434, and that it has 1024 kbytes or kilobytes of memory here. In other words, it has 1 meg of video memory, and it has a RAM DAC on board. So what I'm going to use, I'm going to use this information that I've got here using superprobe. Once again, that was superprobe with a capital S and a capital P. It's one word. I'll use this information when I go ahead and set up X. There's another utility If you notice here, I've did a ls, or a list of all the files that are in /usr/bin/x11, and I can see that there is a utility called xf86config. This is the utility that I use in Slackware to set up X windows. This time, that's what I'm going to do. I'll type xf86config. It's going to ask me a number of questions. Okay, it wants to know what type of mouse that I have. I have a Microsoft mouse. It wants to know if I want to do cord middle. No, I do not. Wants to know if I want to emulate 3 buttons. No, I do not. Wants to know what type of mouse I have or where it's installed connected to. I can just go ahead and press the default here, /dev/mouse. I don't have to enter anything. It's to know if my keyboard, if I want it to generate non-ASCII characters in X. I don't want to do this. I don't want to change the key bindings. Now, it wants to know for the specifications on the monitor. I have looked to see what my horizontal sync in kHz in my monitor's manual is. Found the information there. Now it wants to know what the range of my monitor is for the vertical sync. I found that is 1. And now I have to identify, enter a string, which means just type in a name. I don't have to do that here. I can go ahead and just press enter, and it'll create a default name for me. That's what I'll do here. And now it wants to know if I want to look at the card database. Say yes. And I can go ahead and see that I don't have any of these video cards here, so I'll press a space. Or I'll press enter to go to the next page. I happen to have a Diamond Speedstar 64. Notice that it has the CLGD 5434 that I found out was a chipset using SuperProbe, but I also know that I have a Diamond Speedstar 64 card inside of my computer here. So I'll be able to answer this one with the number 31. And it's telling me here that the server that I need to install it onto is the XF86 SVGA server. Well, that's the one that I installed during the installation of Slackware. And now it wants to determine which server to run. Well, I'm going to use the SVGA server that I selected during the installation, which is option 3. But I could also choose number 5, which is the server from the card definition, which once again is the SVGA. And it wants to know if it wants to set up the symbolic loops that are needed to run X Windows, and yes, I want it to go ahead and do it. And it asks me if I want to set it into its predefined location. Yes, I do. Now it wants to know how much video memory that I have on the card. If you recall, using SuperProbe, I found that it had 1024K, which is option number 3. Now it wants to know information about the card definition for the Diamond Speedstar 64, but I'm going to just go ahead and press the enter key here, and default information is going to be entered for me here. I don't need to have a clock chip setting here because it warned me not to put one during the SuperProbe, and it doesn't want to have it probe clocks, and the card definition says not to probe clocks, so I don't want it to be done. So I say no here. Now here are what the resolutions that the server will set up, and this is what it has for by default, and I'm just going to say that the modes are okay. And now it's going to write the XF86 config file. This is the file that when you boot X, it looks at that file to be able to determine how to display onto your screen. I have XF86 config, the configuration file written, and I should be able to go ahead and start up X. And I can do that by typing start X. And if I did everything correctly, X Windows should come up and run. Now we have X Windows. It's installed under Slackware. And you have the opportunity now to explore, use your mouse to navigate around in X Windows, to bring up various applications, and to install the applications that we did not install during this time.